In this video, I'm not going to focus on privacy or responsibility. I'm going to focus on two concerns, two risks, two issues. First, bias and discrimination in the context of using and developing artificial intelligence. Bias is a well-developed, robust finding within the cognitive sciences. But also if you focus on computer sciences or artificial intelligence, we can distinguish at least two notions, two concepts of bias. First, statistical bias, and second, moral bias. Statistical bias is a kind of bias that is situated at the level of the input of an AI system. So it's about training an AI system and using a data set in order to train the model. And more specifically, statistical bias is about the fact that the data set that we are using in order to train a model is not representative. And for example, we could have a data set that consists only of male human beings and not female human beings, only a minority of the human beings is female, right? And thus we have a data set that is not representative, and thus we have statistical bias. Moral bias is situated at the level of the output. So it's about the text, the picture, the video that has been generated by an AI system, by the Gen AI, by a chatbot. So it's about the output, and it's about the fact that, for example, when you look at the text that has been generated by an AI system, speaks mostly about male CEOs. And in this context, thus, we have a moral bias because the text is not neutral, it's not representative, it only talks about male human beings and not so much about female human beings, not about female CEOs. And that moral bias is, of course, in most cases, in effect, and non-intended, but in effect of a statistical bias. I'll come back to that in a minute. Let's focus on discrimination. And I try to stress that discrimination is different from bias. And I stress that because a lot of normative ethicists, a lot of people that discuss the ethical issues with artificial intelligence tend to use both terms and words in order to refer to one and the same phenomenon. And I think that's unjustified. We should distinguish them. We should distinguish bias, moral bias, from discrimination. Discrimination is about unequal treatment. And more specifically, it's about unequal treatment between human beings or groups of human beings that is based upon properties, characteristics that are irrelevant. We have sexism, we have racism, ageism, ableism, and lookism. All of them are examples of discrimination, of negative discrimination, of unequal treatment that is based upon a property, a characteristic that is completely morally irrelevant. Any kind of discrimination, any kind of negative discrimination is a kind of moral bias. However, not every kind of moral bias is an example of discrimination, and therefore it should be distinguished, right? So discrimination and unequal treatment based upon something that is irrelevant is about an output that is not neutral anymore, right? But you could also detect a moral bias and a non-neutral output by an AI system that is undesirable, that is not neutral, but it is not discriminatory. It's undesirable but not discriminatory, and thus you could say discrimination is a kind of moral bias, but not every kind of moral bias is an example of discrimination. Let's distinguish them. Okay, let's have a look at a couple of examples. There are many examples of sexism, ageism in the context of artificial intelligence. But probably the most known example comes from Amazon. In 2018, the press company, the press agency, Reuters, made clear that the American company Amazon used artificial intelligence, used an AI system in order to screen, in order to assess the CVs from people that were applying for a job at Amazon. Well, the AI system was rejecting all the CVs from the female candidates. So once the AI system detected that the application came from a female human being, then the application was rejected by the AI system. In normal circumstances, we would say that this is an example of sexism. Here, a lot of people tend to say this is an example of what we call algo-sexism. And we also have a lot of examples of algo-racism, algo-lookism, and algo-ageism, right? So this kind of moral bias, and more specifically discrimination, sexism, is situated at the output level, and thus is an example of moral bias, is of course, it's an effect, it's a non-intended effect of the statistical bias that is situated at the input level. More specifically, the company Amazon and the people that were using or that were developing the AI system, they chose for a very specific data set, right? They chose for the CVs from persons, from human beings that were in the past successful when applying for a job at Amazon. And in this case, it was mostly about male human beings. So they had a data set consisting only or mostly of male human beings that were in the past successful in applying for a job at Amazon. And so the system learned that there is a strong correlation between, on the one hand, your gender identity, and on the other hand, being successful in applying at Amazon. So that strong correlation has been detected by the AI system. What the AI system then is doing is just reproducing that strong correlation in the output. And thus, when it detected that the application came from a female human being, that application was rejected by the AI system. So the moral bias here is clearly an effect of the statistical bias at the input level. Let's focus on another example, more about the input bias, the statistical bias. And it's an example that's come from, among others, Joseph Henry. Together with a couple of colleagues, he did research on the data set that is used in order to train ChatGPT, the chatbot from OpenAI. And Joseph Henry is a scientist who once coined the acronym, the term WEIRD, that stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, and Democratic. And he coined that acronym once to refer to the fact that in the social sciences, in the humanities, a lot of data are very weird. They come from Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic human beings. And thus, a lot of research, a lot of social sciences are not representative. Well, what is the case for the sciences is also the case for ChatGPT. It became clear after research that a large part, the majority of the data that was used in order to train ChatGPT was very weird. It was data that were coming from the United States, Western Europe, and Australia. So people living in Latin America, for example, Eastern Europe, Asia, or African countries were not represented in the data set in order to train ChatGPT. And thus, we have reason to say that ChatGPT is a weird chatbot, is a weird technology. So it's clear that in many cases, the moral bias is an effect of the statistical bias. And that already points to solutions that we can develop in order to tackle the risk, in order to mitigate the risk. And one of them is, of course, to create awareness among the people that are developing the system, the AI system. More precisely, the engineer, the computer scientist, the AI designers. They should be aware of the fact that when you're developing the system, and thus when they are choosing a very specific data set, that they face the risk of choosing a data set that is biased, that is not representative, and thus they face the risk that they will develop a system that could end in a moral bias at the output level. Second instrument in order to mitigate the risk of a moral bias or a statistical bias is we should have diverse teams that are developing the systems. And this is relevant because, as you know, most of the systems, most of the AI systems are trained in either the United States or China. And in the United States, we are mostly talking about a very specific strip. It's about Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, Stanford University, California. And it's of course clear that the people that are working there are not representative of the entire world population. It mostly consists of male human beings, between their 25 and 45, computer scientists, engineers, white people, and pretty liberal left-wing people with very liberal ideas about political organization of the society, right? And it's clear that this is not representative. This is a weird group of people that are developing the AI systems. So what we should also include females. We should also include researchers or people from the humanities, from the social sciences, and also people that are older than 45. So we should have more diverse teams that are developing their systems, because that decreases the risk of statistical bias, and thus it decreases the risk of a moral bias at the output level.